Do you want to learn how to make these kind of sounds? Well, that's what we're going to go over today, but first I want to show you how FM works in general. So the best way to do that is by using Faceplant because it's very visual in the way that it shows FM. And really the main thing that you need to know is the two different versions of FM that are available and the characteristics that each of these has. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up two analog oscillators. You'll see that one is the one that we're actually listening to because this is the output that sends it to lane 1 over here and then to the output of the synth. And then we have this analog over here which we don't actually hear, but we can use this one to modulate this waveform over here. For now, I'm going to set both of these to a sine wave because that gives us the best representation of what is going on. And as I said before, there's two versions of FM. What we can either do is the classical version of FM where you actually modulate the frequency of the oscillator. So that would take the pitch of the oscillator and turn it up and down like this really quickly. Or what we could also do is modulate the phase. So that would give us an oscillator that's actually moving back and forth like this. Because what the FM tries to accomplish is the effect of the pitch of the sound changing in audio rate. So that means that this oscillator is playing at a rate that you can actually hear and not at a much lower rate like your classical LFOs are playing. But from FM we expect a sound of the carrier, which is what this oscillator over here is called, the one being modulated by the modulator. We expect this carrier to have a sound of pitch being changed really quickly. So how then do we achieve this with the phase? By changing the frequency over here, it is clear that we're changing the pitch over time, and if we modulate this pitch with an FM setup over here with the data that is coming out of this oscillator, if this is being tied to the modulation of this parameter, you can imagine that over time the pitch is changing because we're literally affecting the pitch here. But with the phase it is not that clear until you think about this waveform is being played. So if it's moving forward while it's being played like this, if we're going from minus 180 to positive 180, you can see it kind of moves forward by a whole cycle. You can imagine that we can modulate it much further by just going in a circle because these are circular values, right? 180 and minus 180 look exactly identical here. You can just look at the start over here to verify that. So you can just continuously circularly increase this parameter if you wanted to. So we can move the waveform forward really fast or backwards really fast while it's playing. And a waveform that is coming towards you, just like a truck that is coming towards you, you have to add the two velocities together. If you're driving one way 50 kilometers an hour and a truck is driving your way 50 kilometers an hour, you're together going 100 kilometers an hour relative to each other. And that is also what is happening here with the pitch. The waveform is kind of moving towards the playhead while it is being played and therefore it gets pitched up. Whereas if we modulate it in the other way, it is moving away and therefore the waveform and the playback are kind of stuck more together. You can imagine that if it's moving backwards at the exact same speed as the playback, we don't actually get a change in the sound because the part that the playback is reading is always staying in the same spot. Right, so say that the playback is over here and it's moving backwards at the same speed that, say, the playhead is playing as well. You can imagine that the playhead will always stay in the same point in the cycle. But if we move it a little bit slower or a little bit faster, then we get the speed relative to the playhead. And that means that we can determine the pitch of the sound by changing the phase. And to show you that in practice, what we can do is we can actually go ahead and phase modulate this. You can see that there's parts where the waveform speeds up and parts where the waveform slows down. And the way that this works is that you can see that if the cycle is rapidly changing position, that is where the FM is the fastest, where the pitch is the highest. And if it's not changing position whatsoever, it either flips over like we see in these cases over here, or it's a lot slower like we see very close to it. To show you the difference between the two versions of FM, I'm also going to set up an FM over here on the pitch in the same way. And you can see that we're generating a slightly different shape. But in terms of the main idea that you see conveyed over here, where we have a slow part and a faster part, this is kind of what we would expect. Because you can see here we have a fast rate of change, we have a slow rate of change, a fast rate of change, a slow rate of change, a fast rate of change. And we also see that same pattern over here. In this case though, they're lining up a little bit differently. One of the things that you'll notice is that this slowest part does not line up with this slowest part. In this case, there's a high pitch over here and there's a high pitch over here because this modulation is bipolar. So it's going both in lower pitch and in higher pitch. And for the times that it goes up in higher pitches, you can imagine that that is where it's going to speed up. But for lower pitches, it should also be clear if you keep in mind that, again, changing the pitch over here changes what the waveform looks like later on in the playback. Over here at the start, of course, it doesn't really make a difference because that is where it's kind of anchored. But say that we're playing back at a really high pitch, like we can see over here. We have a really high pitch here, and now I slow this down really quickly. say that the playhead is slowly moving like this, you can imagine that the waveform is kind of oscillating through the playhead while the playhead is slowly moving across this waveform. So that means that even a low value in the modulation of the FM can result in a high pitch, and therefore we get basically per oscillation 2 areas where we have high pitch and 2 areas where we have low pitch. Now, of course, one of the important things that you can do with FM is not just FM sine waves to each other. You can, of course, use other FM modulations over here, and you'll see that there's different ways that affects the different waveforms. In this case, because there's not really actually a rate of change happening over here, the phase is just kind of moving slowly back and forth at a constant rate, and therefore we get a constant pitch. It should be noted though that this playback and this playback does reproduce a slightly different pitch. So you will see that all of these clicks, this one, and this one kind of lines up with the points over here. And this part has a slightly lower pitch because the phase is moving backwards, while this part has a slightly higher pitch because the phase is moving forwards. Now with the square wave, it is a little bit different because it doesn't actually like dynamically change the phase. It just sets it from one position to another position. And we can see that over here, right at the snapping points, is where you can see where the phase rapidly changes from one position to another. And then it stays relatively normal until the next point where it changes. And you can see that the change has a massive effect over here in that there's like a big click being generated there. But the rest of the waveform still basically looks like a sine wave. Here we have an upward saw wave, and we can see that we're moving the phase forward at a constant rate. And then at the click is where it resets, so there we get a little bit of a mess. But this is basically what we would expect from phase-based FM. Now I kind of focused on phase-based FM because it is the most common one. Phaseplant actually gives you the ability to use both of them, but most soft synths are going to use a phase-based FM because it's easier to implement. So that is the thing that you'll probably focus on the most. Now going into the patches themselves, all 3 of these patches use a fairly basic FM setup that we should now be able to explain. In order to do so, I'm temporarily going to turn off any filtering and any effects that may be on the patches. But this is the very first one. So what is happening here is that we're using the sub oscillator, which is a sine wave, to FM this saw wave over here. So you can imagine that the phase of the sound is moving backwards and forwards in a sine wave movement. But that movement is happening every 2 cycles because we have the sub oscillator 1 octave below our main oscillator over here. So saw wave plays twice, and in that time the phase moves forwards and backwards as a sine wave. And that is the characteristic sound that we get over here. One of the cool things you can do with FM setups if you really want to listen to what is happening from like a single cycle idea is you can tune your modulator very low. And it kind of starts to work as an LFO in that you can actually hear the modulation happening itself. It's no longer contained to 1 wave cycle. We're basically now using 8 wave cycles of this oscillator for 1 wave cycle of this oscillator. And we can go even further by upping this 2 octaves and then tuning our MIDI down 2 octaves. And we can hear that we get these 2 distinct kind of screeching sounds where one is slightly higher in pitch than the other. And you can imagine why that is, because for one of these oscillations, it is moving the phase forward. And then for other oscillation where it's going back down again, it's moving the phase backwards. Remember that when we saw the sine waves, it wasn't actually over here and over here where the phase version of FM was at its fastest. It was actually in the parts between where the rate of change was the highest. So now hopefully you understand why we get, if you speed up that effect that we just heard of the modulator kind of moving up, then down, moving up, and then down again, you can hear how we get this particular timbre here. Moving on to the next one, we can see a new concept over here. First of all, we're using a triangle wave. Again, this is using FM that is based on the phase because that is what CRM uses. It doesn't matter which version of FM you choose over here from oscillator A, from the noise oscillator or the sub oscillator over here, it will always use the phase. And that means that we have the phase moving forward at 1 speed and then backwards at another speed. In this case, we have a ratio of what you call it of a modulator of 0.25 to 1, which means that for 1 oscillation of the carrier, we have 0.25 oscillations of the modulator, which makes sense because it's 2 octaves lower, meaning that you would need 4 wave cycles of the carrier to get 1 wave cycle of the modulator. Now in this case, we're also changing the FM amount What that does is it changes kind of the range of this modulation that is happening. So how far back and forth is the phase actually being changed here? That is what increasing this amount over here does. So in this case, we get this kind of telephone sound. And again, you can imagine why that is the case, because we just have a sine wave playing at one speed and then at another speed, so you get these kind of two pitches. And that is responsible for getting that nice kind of bleepy sound. Now the last one is a little bit more complex because you can actually use multiple stages of FM. In this case, we have the sub-oscillator FMing oscillator A, which then is being used to FM oscillator B over here. And that oscillator B is the only one that is producing sound. Now I don't necessarily have to do that. What I personally often do is having all of my modulators at -infinity, so that they're not actually producing sounds, they're just there for the modulation part. But there are some sounds where you might want to have both of them coming through, say, the bandpass filter over here. And that is just going to give you a little bit of texture because now you're mixing two versions of an FM setup. In this case though, it is really hard to kind of follow what is happening. You have to kind of come up with an idea in your head of what this waveform is going to look like in order to determine what its effect is going to be on this wave cycle over here. And naturally, that isn't really the way that we like to do FM. I have been talking about it in a very calculated manner, in the sense that I just try to explain exactly what is happening. But in practice, that is not really how we tend to use FM. We tend to just experiment, and especially within psytrance, because there's so many different types of FM that we like to use and different setups that result in maybe the classic bubble sounds, the classic clicky sounds, the classic kind of gritty FM sound, the classic bandpass version of that, the non-bandpass version of that. You have a lot of virus-related FM trickery that tends to happen. There's some of my older experiments like my SSQ emulations. So there's a lot of different characteristics that you can go for within the group of FM, and knowing how to make certain versions of that only kind of comes through experience, and that comes through a lot of experimentation. In my recent guide on glitch, I also talked about this, where I talked about the idea of needing to experiment in your own time to know what you do in your production. A lot of my experimentation in my sessions include some form of FM setup. There's the classical way that we're doing it in here. There's the way where you go inside of the noise oscillator and you drop in a shape that you want by drawing it in the LFO over here, and then you can tune up the noise oscillator to a very high octave. And what that means is that now you can use this to modulate any parameter, including a pitch if you want your classical pitch-based FM. So you just go to noise oscillator over here, and now you have a pitch-based FM setup for your noise oscillator. For some reason it doesn't really display well, but you can set the amount over here. But you can even use something like filter FM, which I've also explained in the channel before, where you modulate the filter with an audio rate signal. So again, we can set that up here. And obviously you can get some pretty wonky sounds out of that. And you can imagine that this is a technique that you can use in many more different ways. Another one that I want to show you that I've learned from Mute Productions is that you can set this to a particular frequency. Of course, you would tune this to the frequency of your track, and then you can use this to modulate the pitch over here, like so. And now you can draw in different shapes. Let me actually get rid of whatever is happening on the noise oscillator here. And now we can get different ideas in terms of FM from this. We'll also disable this and this. So you can hear that this is purely coming from this sound over here. So there's many different ways that you can use FM and many different ways that you can set it up, as long as you keep in mind what the basic principles of FM are. And of course, as I said, you don't even really need to know what is actually happening in the oscillator. I showed very nice examples inside of Faceband, but that's not how we tend to do FM. We tend to do it by ear, as opposed to kind of calculating what is going to happen if I phase shift this like that and that and that and all of that kind of stuff. We don't really tend to work that way. So what I would recommend for learning FM is just sitting down an afternoon in the session and seeing what kind of crazy setups you can come up with. But that's going to be it for today. I hope that you enjoyed this one. Let me know if you did by leaving a like, and make sure that you subscribe to the channel. Another way to support the channel is by making sure that you watch some more of my videos. Another way to support the channel is by watching some more of my videos. So I'll leave 2 videos up on the screen for you to choose from. So just pick one and enjoy, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.